Sinful regression. We should not be surprised when leaders who deliberately violate God's spiritual and moral laws become more and more rebellious and evil. Here's Gene.
We see this principle graphically illustrated in all the kings of Israel. And we read again and again in the Scriptures that they all did what was evil in the Lord's sight. And we come now to King Omri, who was a king in Israel. And look at what we read in 1 Kings 16:25. Omri did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He did more evil than all who were before him. What an accomplishment that is, to do more evil than all of the other kings before him. You see the degeneration that is taking place. And then, speaking of degeneration, here comes Ahab, who was Omri's son. 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 30 to 33. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight more than all who were before him, including his own father. So you see him going downhill, deteriorating, degenerating. We read on. Then, as if following the sin of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, were a trivial matter, he married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians. And that, of course, is an incredible violation of the will of God for the kings of both Israel and the southern kingdom. And then he proceeded, that is, Ahab proceeded to serve Baal and worship him. Baal, of course, was the god that Jezebel, one of the major gods in Jezebel's life. He set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal that he had built in Samaria. Ahab also made an Asherah pole. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel than all the kings of Israel who were before him. You have an incredible, dramatic illustration here of this principle of degeneration, deterioration, regression. And so you can see how these kings illustrate this principle. Let's just look at the principle again, and you see how this principle grows out of the way they lived. We should not be surprised when leaders who deliberately violate God's spiritual moral laws become more and more rebellious and evil. And that is the story of the kings of Israel. There wasn't one man in Israel, the kings of Israel, the northern tribes, that lived in the will of God. Not one of them. There were a few in Judah who did, but again, many of them as well were just as sinful as the kings of the north. We have some exceptions, but most of them were guilty of this sinful regression. So basically, you look back at this, you look at the kings of Israel, you look at the kings of Judah, and then you move on into the New Testament, you move into the Roman Empire. And the fact is that the story of Israel's kings, and in the kings of Judah as well, is an example of sinful humanity, really in the Roman Empire, but throughout history. You see this digression and regression, right? Digression from the will of God and regression in sin. You see this downward slide of all humanity from idolatry to depravity. Look at Romans chapter 1, verses 21 to 23. For though they knew God, there was a point in their life where they knew God. That was true of the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. That was true of Solomon. For though they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God or show gratitude. Instead, their thinking became nonsense, and their senseless minds were darkened. You see, that's a result of sinful regression. It's also the cause of sinful regression. It's circular. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling, and notice here the digression, mortal man, birds, four-footed animals, and reptiles. You actually see in the enumeration and the listing of their regression in this statement. Mortal man worshiping themselves. You look at the Roman Empire, you look at all those statutes that they worshipped almost as, well, they did worship the Roman emperors. And you go into that situation today and you see these images of the emperors, the worship of mortal man. Nero claimed to be God. If you didn't follow Nero, you weren't following God. And so you have this incredible moving from God to mortal man to birds, next step downward, 4-footed animals, and down to creeping things or reptiles. And so you see this digression. And you also see, if you follow through this passage, that all of this led, first of all, that God gave them over to heterosexual sin, and then God gave them over to homosexual sin, and you see the whole slide downward. And then at the end of that passage, growing out of sexual immorality, grew all these evil practices with murder and abuse and all those situations that are listed there at the end of chapter 1. Perfect illustration, really, of the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, but also an illustration of all humanity. In Noah's day, then Abraham's day, then in the Roman Empire. And it shouldn't surprise us that even in our culture, which was based at least on the Hebrew Christian ethic, and the Ten Commandments is the foundation of our government, that we are in the process of that slide downward. No question about it, if we're realistic. So, you see all of this happening and illustrating this principle. Here's the question to think about, to respond to. In what ways are we seeing this sinful downward spiral taking place in our own culture? Well, in our culture, we see it in secularism. We're moving towards secularism. No question. Even people who aren't believers will tell you we're moving towards secularism. In fact, that's what they want, is secularism. We're moving in that direction. So, therefore, as a result of that move towards secularism, putting it another way, we're moving more and more away from biblical values that were the foundation of our culture. That's just a fact as we look at what's happening. And it began particularly in a pretty serious way, a progressive, regressive way, in the 1960s with the decisions that were made by the Supreme Court. And those decisions made by the same Supreme Court have led to incredible increase in pornography. And of course, the pornography issue has been really accelerated by technology. And it's just permeating our culture. I think it's going to be one of the most destructive influences on marriage. And then when you come out with the very fact that you don't believe in marriage or alternatives to marriage, you combine technology, you combine the decisions that have been made, and you can see where it's leading and where it's heading. And it's a very, very destructive force. And by the way, that's universal now because of the internet. It's not just affecting our culture, it's affecting the whole world's culture. And so, if you want to really draw parallels between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah and the behaviors of those individuals, just think what's happening just through the whole area of pornography and what is portrayed in our culture. And the other decision, freedom of speech. We all love that idea in our culture, freedom of speech. But the freedom of speech has taken on a vileness that's almost unbelievable. Where is it going to stop? See, once you move away and start downward, where are you going to draw the line? And it's very, very sad. It's a sad situation how abuse of a great principle is taking place within our culture. And of course, abortion, taking human life, that's just opened the whole door to legalizing abortion. And you can just see the downward trend, even beyond what the original decision meant in the minds of the Supreme Court, has continued to be reinterpreted downward, 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 until virtually people are taking life of a human being right up to 9 months, just before birth. And it's just so sad to see that happening. And of course, I also mentioned marriage, the alternatives, lifestyles in terms of that. And it's the new normal. And a lot of these things become the new normal, which are indeed leading us into this digression. Violating conscience. And of course, one of the things that we really need to do in terms of our reflection response, and that is we need to model. We need to really model living within a culture and within a worldly system and not becoming a part of it. They did it in the New Testament. They came out of it. I often say, as believers today, we ought to be able to stay out of it with our background and what we've learned today. But on the other hand, it just seems like Satan wants to pull us into it, even though we have the truth. We need, as believers, to model righteousness and holiness. And I say one of the things that is very uncomfortable, but that God uses, is the darker the world becomes, the brighter the light can shine. The darker it becomes, the brighter the light can shine, if indeed we don't become a part of the darkness. So let's remember this principle. We should not be surprised when leaders who deliberately violate God's spiritual and moral laws become more and more rebellious and evil.